Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure from EFSA to welcome you to this webinar on animal byproducts applications. Next slide, please. So, as a short introduction to the event, we have several colleagues involved that will be introducing themselves at the beginning of the presentation. My name is Ernesto Liebana. I'm the team leader of the Biological Hazards team, and I will be moderating the webinar today. So the goal for this webinar is to outline the procedures concerning the implementation of the new transparency regulation. We will try to take you through the journey of submission of applications, how do we tackle confidentiality assessment in EFSA, and try to provide also you with some practical advice based on past lessons learned, and also principles that we consider in the assessment of the dossiers that we receive in EFSA for assessment of alternative methods for processing of ABPs or derived products. Also, as a reminder that any regulatory or risk management aspects around the area of animal byproducts will not be addressed in the webinar. Next slide, please. A few practical lines here. You are automatically connected to an audio broadcast, and there's only one way of oral communication, so you're all only on listen only mode. You will be able to submit questions during the event, during the presentations, and also during short sessions after each of them, and at the end in a dedicated questions and answers chat box. The webinar is going to be conducted in English, and please, we ask you to submit any questions also in this language through the platform. Some of the questions will be answered while the presenters are online, and some others will be answered live. If we don't have the time or some questions are too complex, we will try to also come back to you in a written form after the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded, so it will be accessible afterwards. Next slide, please. And here on the slide, you have the agenda that we have for our webinar today. So it will consist of 4 parts. The first one is an introduction to the topic. Then we will have a second one on the life cycle of applications until the moment they are validated. The third part after validation, and then a fourth part on standards and scientific issues for the assessment. And as I mentioned, we will end up with a questions and answers session. So without any further delays, I give now the floor to my colleague Frank Verdonk and my colleague Angel Ortiz Pelaez, who will take the first part of the presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Welcome to the participants. I'm Frank Verdonk. I'm the head of the BioHow unit, which stands for Biological Hazards, Animal Health and Welfare. Next slide, please. So in this introduction part, we will have the following topics: transparency regulation, the EFSA remit on animal byproducts, the legislation and the EFSA statements, and the format of the applications. Next slide, please. This slide is just to put the context of why we have this webinar today, and it is the transparency regulation that came into force on the 27th of March 2021, with the aim to bring really more transparency to make also the risk assessment a bit more visible, how it has been done. It is applicable to all the dossiers and applications that are submitted after the 27th of March. The next slide, please. The legislation is really describing the high-level principles that we need to follow, but then EFSA has been putting in place practical arrangements. So these are the documents describing the interpretation of the legal framework. And here on this slide, you can find the links to these documents. And this might be useful to understand a bit more the legal context in more detail compared to the transparency legislation itself. At the bottom of the slide, you can also see the link to a question and answer document that has been created by EFSA and includes also some info that we have based on the experience until today. Next slide, please. In this slide and the next slide, I will briefly guide you through the application workflow. And what you can see in green are the new steps indicated by the transparency regulation. I will go very brief over it just for the interest of time, and also my colleagues later on in the webinar will explain more in detail the different steps to you. So let's start with the first box. The first box, it's the business operators who need to notify studies in EFSA that they will use in any future application. The business operator can also request pre-submission advice to EFSA. The third step remains the same as before about the submission of the dossier to the competent authority of the member state. But in the fourth step, you can see that there is also a new element because EFSA is asking the applicant now to submit the application also via an electronic tool, an online tool called Portalino. In the next step, you can see that EFSA will perform the completeness suitability check of the application as we have done in the past, but at this moment, we will also check the studies that were notified to EFSA as we have seen in the first step of the workflow. The last box here refers to the EFSA validation of the application, which remains similar to what you were used on before the transparency regulation. Next slide, please. Here you can see that EFSA will initiate the confidentiality decision. Before it was a task for the European Commission. Now this is a task of EFSA. EFSA will then publish the non-confidential part of the dossier that has been declared valid and will also publish a summary of the pre-submission advice if that would have been provided for the submitted dossier or application. Then EFSA issues a confidentiality decision of the valid dossier and sanitizes also accordingly the relevant documents, which then will lead into the launching of a public consultation on the valid dossier. EFSA will, at the end of the public consultation, automatically publish the comments that we have received. Then we go into the risk assessment, which remains the same as it was before, and it is the EFSA panel that will adopt the scientific output that is related to the submitted application. The last step is the publication of the scientific output, and here we will also publish additional evidences that will be provided to us, and also the assessment of how we will reply to the comments that we received during the public consultation. Next slide, please. And with this, I hand over to my colleague, Angel.
Thank you very much, Frank. Good afternoon. My name is Angel Ortiz. I work in the Biojo unit, in Biological Hazards and Animal Health and Welfare unit, and I usually work on the animal byproducts and the TSC risk assessment. I'm going to explain the next few minutes the EFSA remit and the legal framework and the format of the ABP applications. Just to start by saying that the EFSA remit in the area of animal byproducts is divided in two different types of outputs. The first one is driven by the Article 29 and Article 31 of the founding regulation of EFSA, and there are mandates directly submitted by the Commission to EFSA. Can you pass the next to the next slide, please? The next one. The next one, please. So these are generic mandates that can cover different topics, but are usually related to overarching aspects that have impact on the EU legislation. And normally, for example, in the last few years, we've been working on the progressive lift of the feed ban, issues like ruminant collagen and gelatin, processed animal proteins. Lately, for example, last year, we published the opinion on the application of animal byproducts for organic fertilizers and soil improvers. So this is one of the type of work that we do. The next slide. The next slide is driven by a different type of legislation, which is the AVP regulation that I will mention in a minute. And here there is a direct mandate from the legislation for EFSA to conduct evaluation of the alternative methods for use and disposal of animal byproducts. The next slide, please. And these are the main focus of the webinar today. The applications by interested parties for the approval of alternative methods that are not included in the legislation. And that could be a wide range. I just put there a number of the latest applications that we have evaluated, for example, for the production of renewable fuels, biodiesel, composting, etc. The next slide, please. So when just for those who are not familiar, the main body of legislation regarding AVPs are made by two pieces. The first one is the Regulation 1069/2009, which is what we call the AVP regulation. Is the overarching piece of legislation that it's aimed at protecting the public and animal health from the use, transformation, storage, processing, and disposal of animal byproducts. We have to remember that the whole AVP regulation is driven by the BSE epidemic and also in align with the TSE regulation 999/2001. So we can find in this regulation the sort of definitions. We have the classification of animal byproducts in three categories based on different level of TSE risk and the general principles of the AVP legislation. However, this is complemented by the implementing regulation 142/2011, which actually develop and provide more technical details on how to protect the public and animal health. So basically, it contains, and among others, the standard alternative processing methods of animal byproducts, and then there is a full array of instructions on how to dispose, use, trade, export, import, official control, certification, derogation, etc. So these are the two main pieces of legislation. Can you pass the next one, please? So if we go to the particular Article 20 of the 1069 regulation, there is where the applications are described and are regulated. Basically, any interested party, even also the Commission or a member state, can submit an application for the evaluation of an alternative method. Usually, the regulation requires that if the interested party wants to submit a dossier to EFSA, first they have to submit it to the member state, the competent authority of the member state where the industry or the party is registered. And during these 2 months, the competent authority must do a pre-assessment of the dossier and evaluate whether it complies with the format of the applications. And now we will focus on the format of the applications in the next few minutes. Basically, in 2010, EFSA published a statement on the technical assistance for the format of application for new alternative methods. Basically, it was a kind of guidelines on what the application should contain and how they should demonstrate the level of safety that is required by the legislation. Very broadly, it was, as I said, the guidelines. The Commission took this statement and transposed it to the Annex 7 of the Commission Regulation 142. Can you go ahead, please? And it took most of the recommendations of the EFSA statement and listed the points that should include it in the application for alternative methods. So in the next the final minutes, I will just explain what are the contents that the Commission regulation requires to be included. The first point I want to say is that at any moment, the applicant has the right to claim confidential any part of the dossier, and this part on how this is managed and by EFSA, it will be explained later on during the webinar. I will focus only now on the description of the different items that the application must contain. The first one is the description of the process. Basically, that is the key issue that needs to be fully described, the entire process, the flow of the material from the raw materials to the end product. And it has also to include any details of, for example, any co-products or byproducts. For example, there are materials like glycerin that comes out of the production of biodiesel that they are a valuable product, so it's a co-product, and opposed to byproducts which are disposed and they don't have any specific further use. It's important that the critical parameters of the method, whether this is thermal or chemical or any other, should be clearly specified. Temperature, pressure, time, pH, particle size, any parameter that defines the method. Also, it's important to specify the material that's going to be treated with full details, not only the EVPs that are going to be used, but also any other material could be mixed with the EVPs in the process. It's important to know that, because in some occasions, the materials that are mixed with animal byproducts could have an impact on the level of reduction of the risk due to the interaction with the EVPs. And this is something that occurs normally, for example, when in the production of biodiesel, sometimes the alternative methods include ethanol, and the ethanol could be a material that could jeopardize the detection of the level of risk reduction or the measurement. It has to be the physical status of the material, the water content, if it is solid, liquid, the particle size, if it's going to be pre-treated by any of the standard methods required by the legislation or any other. So this has also to be very well explained. And finally, two important points: the hazard identification and the level of risk reduction. Just basically, I'm not going to elaborate on them, because at the end of the webinar, there will be a presentation that will focus on how these 2 points should be elaborated in the applications. But basically, it's the characterization of the biological hazards that could be present in the EVPs that are included in the method, and also how the biological hazards that have been identified will be reduced to the required level based on the standards or in the regulation. The next slide, please. And then the application must include a hazard analysis and critical control points plan with full flow diagrams, the definition of the critical control points, the rationale for them. They have to be designed according to the industrial setting where the method is going to be applied, the critical parameters, what are the limits of these critical parameters that are we going to be considered for to trigger a corrective action, how they are linked to the equipment that are in the setting that the method is going to be applied, how these parameters are going to be monitored and recorded, if they're going to be, for example, doing manually or automatically in a continuous or intermittent manner. All these details should be included in the hazard plan. Also, that the hazard plan should be designed describing the normal operating procedures, but also any emergency that could occur during the process and how what actions are going to be triggered in order to correct the emergency, any contingency that could occur. 2 more points: the risk associated to the interdependent processes. Basically, is there any risk associated with any of the co-products, with the transportation, the storage of all the disposal of the byproducts or co-products? And then the risk associated with the intended end use. So is there any possible risk that the end product, like, could be any, like I mentioned before, it could be, for example, fuels, biodiesel, that could pose to the human or to animal health or to the environment based on the use of these materials? And not last but not least, very important to have full information, contact details, documentary evidence, flow diagrams, charters, description of the equipment, technical specification, etc., that could help to assess the method, and the contact address. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, an example of themes and topics that we have covered in the area of AVPs in the last 20 years. The next one, just to give you basically related to the safety of animal byproducts or the safety of derived products. Next one, please. Safe disposal and processing methods, alternative processing methods, as I just described. And just the last final slide, we added here more links or information that are available in the EFSA website about animal byproducts. So I leave it there, and now I give the floor back to Ernesto. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you, Angel, for the presentation. We have received one question that will be answered in the final session, clustered with others, since this was already a pre-registered question. So with that, I would like to go on and give the floor to my colleague, Laura Paltrinieri, for the next presentation. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm Laura Paltrinieri. I'm Scientific Officer from FDP, the Front Desk and Planning Unit, and I'm delighted to guide you through the life cycle of an application until validation. Next slide, please. Here the content of my presentation. So we will go through pre-submission activities, the submission of the dossier, so how to use the Portalino, how we will perform the completeness check and the timeline from submission to validation. At the end, some slides on the information, general information. So next slide, please. Yes, let's start with the pre-submission activities, which includes the general pre-submission advice and the notification of studies. So next slide. Yes, before we start any pre-submission activity, we have to do a registration process. So as indicated in the practical arrangement on the pre-submission phase and public consultation, and I invite you to consult the link at the bottom of this slide, which is the same that was also introduced at the beginning in the introduction. In order to initiate any pre-submission activity, a potential applicant, business operator, a laboratory or testing facility have to register in or connect EFSA. If we have a third parties that represent one or more entity, also you should register in Connect EFSA. So basically, all the players, all the important actors that are around the submission of a dossier have to register and to have an account. Next slide. So I mentioned Connect EFSA. So here I reported a screenshot of the portal in Connect EFSA. So what you have to do is to click on the registration portal button, as you can see in the slide. Once you enter, what you have to do first is to register the entity, so the company. After this is done, then the individuals that are being part of the company can register a link to the respective entity. Once you enter in the registration portal, you will find different fields that needs to be filled. So we invite you to complete all the registration as much as possible. EFSA will do a check of the information, a quality security check, and this will take a couple of days. So your account will not be activated immediately, but just a couple of days later. Next slide. Yes. So, okay, you are registering Connect EFSA, and you would like to have a pre-submission, you would like to start a pre-submission activity, which is a general pre-submission advice or a notification of study. The first step is to request a pre-application ID. In this slide is represented by a folder because the pre-application identification contains three main elements. One is the business operator, so the applicant. The second element is the subject of the application. So is actually the identification of the regulated product. The third element is the intended area. So the intended area shall report the regulated product area. In your case will be animal byproducts. Next slide. Okay, so you have your pre-application ID and now you can ask for a general pre-submission advice. Very important, the general pre-submission advice is an optional step, so it's not mandatory to submit an application to EFSA. It's upon request of a potential applicant. How to request for a general pre-submission advice? You have to fill in the dedicated general pre-submission advice form in Connect EFSA, and you have to create a pre-application ID. So you can ask for a general pre-submission advice anytime, but of course before you submit your application to EFSA, at least 6 months. So I invite you to click on the frequently asked question link over here just to discover more on what falls under the remit of a general pre-submission advice. Next slide. The workflow for a general pre-submission advice is that first the potential applicant registered to Connect EFSA, as we have seen in the first slides. Then you get a pre-application ID. After, the potential applicant can ask for a pre-submission advice anytime before the submission. EFSA receives the general pre-submission advice and based on the practical arrangements, provides a feedback. Only once the application will be valid, so not immediately, the general pre-submission advice summary will be published. Next slide. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the pre-submission activities is also the notification of study. So here I just wanted to report the definition of a study according to Article 2 of the EFSA practical arrangement on the pre-submission phase and public consultation. So I would like to stress three key elements of the definition of a study. First, that the study is defined as an experiment or a set of experiments. Second, that it has to be done under laboratory condition and that it is relevant for the submission. So I know that often in animal byproduct application we have literature references. Well, those are not considered a study. Studies is only under laboratory condition. So even if a study that refers to previous literature, this is not considered a study. So only new studies. Also, the applicant have to notify the study only if they have been commissioned or started after the implementation of the transparency regulation. So March 27, 2021. The studies need to be notified before the starting date. So in case of delay or notification, then the notification is after the starting date of the study, then the applicant must provide a justification for delay. Next slide. Here are the steps for notification of study. So first, the business operator, after registration in the portal in Connect EFSA, needs to get a pre-application ID. then both the business operator and the laboratory testing facility have to notify the study. Then we have step 2, submission of an application. When the business operator provides the dossier to EFSA, then he has to include inside the dossier the information related to the study. If the study was notified with delay, then a justification should be provided. Everything is collected in the database of study notification. In the third step, as it was for the general pre-submission advice, the EFSA will publish the study, the notification. So only when the dossier will be valid. Next slide. Okay, so we have seen the pre-submission activities. Now we go into the submission of the dossier. Again, pre-submission activities are not mandatory in case of a general pre-submission advice, but only when you have a study that has been performed after 27th of March, then it should be notified. Okay, this is the dossier intake workflow. Is actually what you have already seen in the first presentation. So after asking for a pre-submission advice that is optional, then the applicant must submit the application to the member state competent authority. The member state competent authority makes the dossier available to EFSA. Only then EFSA will communicate to the applicant and ask the applicant to provide the dossier through Portalino. So Portalino is an internal tool of EFSA. And it is used because it's meant to also combine the confidential and non-confidential version of the dossier, and also to allow the public consultation after validity. Portalino is not related to Connect EFSA. So therefore, Portalino follows a different route. We can go to the next slide. Yes, so to access Portalino, you have to register first. The potential applicant needs to send a registration request to service desk at EFSA at europa.eu, and he has to specify the organization details as reported here in the slide, and the registration request. In case you are registering Connect EFSA, also report this in your request. EFSA will validate the request and provide the credential. You can see here the link to Portalino. Next slide. This is a screenshot of how Portalino looks. So you will have actually two very important input for the document. So the full version, and this is considered the confidential version of the dossier, and the non-confidential version. So you have to provide both documents in Portalino. Next slide. Because of the time doesn't allow to go into details, but I invite you to consult the quick guide on Portalino, which is in this link, and the video tutorial. In any case, if you have any issue related to the IT portal of Portalino, please contact Service Desk and we will provide support. Next slide. Yes. So we have seen the pre-submission activities, how to submit the dossier through Portalino. Now it's time for EFSA to perform the completeness check. Next slide. So the completeness check is done by the FDP, my unit, and is based on the Annex 7 of the Regulation 142/2011, as well explained by the presentation before. All the mandatory steps that should be included in the dossier are explained in the Annex 7. When we receive the dossier, we have 30 working days to perform the completeness check. If the dossier is not complete, or some key information are missing, or if the notification of study as issue and has not been done in a correct way, then we will issue a request for missing information. The applicant has to reply to the request for missing information by providing a new consolidated dossier through Portalino again. So when you receive a request for missing information, then you have to provide again the dossier in Portalino, as I explained before. Also very important, when we do the completeness check, it can happen that we realize that some of the studies should have been notified, but they have not. And if the applicant did not register to Connect EFSA, he can do it upon request of EFSA. So then you can go through the registration process and notify the study. Of course, in this case, the study will be notified with delay, so the justification should be provided. If the dossier is complete, then FDP will validate the dossier, and then it will go to the next phase. So next slide. Yes, here is the end. So I would like here to present you a tool that EFSA has in place to support the applicant along the whole process of the submission of a dossier. The tool is Ask EFSA Question. This can be used by all the EFSA stakeholders, and it is meant to be used for regulated product area. And you can use it for administrative, scientific issue, regulatory framing on specific area, guidance document, procedural steps, actually any doubts that you might have in the submission of your dossier. You have to fill in the dedicated form on the website, Connect EFSA, and this can be done anytime. You can use Ask EFSA Question anytime during the process of your application. Normally, we respond within 15 working days. So here there is also a link that you can open and see more about EFSA Ask a Question. So next slide. This is the final slide and includes all the useful links that you are invited to open and read related to the practical arrangements, the transparency regulation, the catalog of services of EFSA, and the user guide for notification of study for application ID. And again, Ask a Question and Connect EFSA and Portalino. So I give the floor back to Ernesto, and thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your presentation. There were not many questions about this particular topic other than whether this presentation would be made available afterwards, and that is the case, so you will have access to all the links and all the information quoted there. Okay, so then moving on with our topic list, we go now to the next presentation on the life cycle of applications from validation. So I give the floor to my colleagues Vasileios and Angel. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the next slide, please. And the next one as well. These are the contents. So my name is Vasilios Migos. I'm working for EFSA's Legal Affairs Services Unit and inter alia on confidentiality assessment. Speaking about confidentiality assessment, the first step in this process is the so-called light check, which verifies whether there is any obvious incompliance or inadmissibility of the confidentiality requests that are submitted. Afterwards, during the assessment of the merits of the confidentiality requests, EFSA optionally can ask the applicant to provide clarifications on one or more confidentiality requests if deemed necessary. As soon as the assessment is completed, a draft decision is being shared with the applicant, who can provide with comments or withdraw the application in case of disagreement, or explicitly state that agrees with EFSA's draft assessments. At this point, it is worth mentioning that for all these three scenarios, the faster the applicant provides EFSA with feedback, the faster the confidentiality assessment process will be concluded. Then follows the notification of EFSA's EFSA's final decision, based on which takes place the sanitization of the documents, which in practical terms means the unblanketing of the respective information items corresponding to rejected or partially rejected confidentiality requests. In case of disagreement with the final decision, the applicant may submit a confirmatory application, which puts on hold the implementation of the confidentiality decision and postpones the conclusion of the confidentiality assessment. As soon as the confidentiality assessment process is concluded, EFSA publishes the sanitized documents. If, however, a scientific output of EFSA identifies information that were initially granted confidential status, however, they relate to foreseeable effects on human health, animal health, or the environment, the relevant confidentiality decision is reviewed in accordance with Article 39C of the General Food Law. Next slide, please. So Articles 9 and 10 of EFSA's practical arrangements concerning transparency and confidentiality, in reference also to the respective legal provisions, have put in place procedural and substantive requirements for the submission of confidentiality requests. For the animal byproducts dossiers, such procedural requirements would be: the confidentiality requests are submitted via Portalino. They must include verifiable justifications and should be accompanied with a confidential and a non-confidential version of the documents concerned. Confidential is the version that is not published and includes earmarking of the information items that are being claimed as confidential, while the non-confidential or public version is the version of the documents that includes blackening of this same information that are claimed as confidential. It is important here to highlight that the earmarking and the blackening must be applied on exactly the same information items in the different versions of exactly the same documents. After the submission of the confidentiality requests, the applicant may provide clarifications or additional information only if requested to do so by EFSA. Such clarifications must be submitted within the deadline that is set by EFSA. In case of lack of reaction within this deadline, the confidentiality requests will be rejected. The applicant is not allowed to modify any of the submitted confidentiality requests unless requested to do so by EFSA. As you might be already aware, no fees are attached to the submission of the confidentiality requests. Next slide, please. The confidentiality requests can only be submitted with regards to specific information items that are included in the closed positive list, which is provided in the annex of EFSA's practical arrangements. So for the animal byproducts sector, this list identifies with Article 39, paragraph 2 of Regulation 178 of 2002, the General Food Law. And these items are the manufacturing or production process, including the method and innovative aspects thereof, as well as other technical and industrial specifications inherent to that process or method, except for information which is relevant to the assessment of safety. Commercial links between a producer or importer and the applicant or the authorization holder, where applicable. Commercial information revealing sourcing, market shares, or business strategy of the applicant. Quantitative composition of the subject matter of the request, except for information which is relevant to the assessment of safety. Next slide, please. When it comes to personal data, the applicant should submit confidentiality requests on personal data and should blacken personal data, except for the name and address of the applicant, which must always be made public, and the names of authors of published or publicly available studies supporting the application, which again need to always be made public. However, names and addresses of individuals involved in testing on vertebrate animals or in obtaining toxicological information should never be disclosed. Next slide, please. It is very important, we need to highlight here that the applicant submits confidentiality requests and ensures proper permanent blackening of personal data in the non-confidential versions of all documents, because otherwise there is a very high risk that this personal data will be published online and the applicant might be held accountable. Next slide, please. So we talked about the procedural requirements. The substantive requirements that are set by the practical arrangements and must be satisfied by the applicant are to make an explicit mention to all elements that are claimed confidential and describe their exact location in the document, be it the page, the paragraph, the line, etc. It is worth mentioning that it is not a good practice and it is not recommended to have entire documents blackened and claimed as confidential, but rather to have keywords blackened that allow proper assessment of the confidentiality request. Indicate the legal basis, which is the legal ground of each confidentiality request, ensuring that the information items claimed as confidential correspond indeed to the legal ground that is invoked. Provide also adequate justification explaining how and why the information items claimed as confidential fall under the legal ground invoked. When submitting the confidentiality requests, it is important that the applicant either ticks the relevant indicators or provides an explanation in their justification as to how the following preconditions are met. These preconditions are that the information is not publicly available, its disclosure may cause significant harm to the applicant, It was acquired legitimately and is therefore eligible for legal protection. It was finalized up to maximum 5 years prior to the confidentiality request. It does not fall under the notion of environmental information as provided in the Aarhus regulation. Next slide, please. As explained already, 2 versions of the documents must be provided in the zipped folders, a full version, which is the confidential version with earmarking, and the non-confidential version, which is the public version with blackening. Then it is the legal ground, which can be selected from a drop-down list, followed by the justification. The fields excerpt of the text and related section allow for the proper identification of the location of the information items that are claimed as confidential. Next slide, please. Last but not least is the list of indicators, which should be either ticked or, if not ticked, there should be provided a relevant explanation in the justification, proving compliance with these criteria. Of course, this does not apply for confidentiality requests on personal data. So it is the potential harm, the worthiness of legal protection, the environmental protection, and novelty. These indicators must always be ticked, or a justification should be provided alternatively. Next slide, please. Here you can find a list of useful documents that relate to the confidentiality assessment. I would like to thank you very much, and I hope that we managed to shed some light on this brand new era of confidentiality. Angel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. Okay, now in the next few minutes, we'll try to explain the next step of the whole process. We have covered so far all what has to do with the preparation of the dossier, with the submission of the dossier to EFSA, all the administrative procedure, also the confidentiality. And now we are at the point that EFSA has sent a letter to the applicant confirming that the completeness check has been successfully finished and that we consider the dossier complete initially and the assessment can start. So that is the point. I will explain the next step until the end point, which is the publication of the evaluation. Can you pass the next slide, please? And in order to do that, we have to go to the legislation back again to explain what is the task that EFSA has been given to do the evaluation. In the point 5 of the Article 20, it is clearly spelled out that EFSA shall assess within 6 months following the receipt of a complete application. And what we mean by receipt of a complete application is what I just mentioned, that the applicant has received the letter with a date saying that we consider the dossier validated. So from that date, it starts counting the 6-month period. And during that period, EFSA should assess whether the alternative method ensures that the risk to public of animal health are either controlled in a manner that they are not proliferated before disposal, during the process, during the implementation of the alternative method, or reduced to a degree which is at least equivalent for the relevant category of animal byproducts to the processing methods that are approved in the legislation. So a kind of comparative analysis. At the end of the process, what we do is that EFSA shall issue an opinion on the application submitted with the final assessment. I have to say that usually what we do in the evaluation, can you go back, please? What we do is usually address the point B. We try to assess the risk associated to the method if they are equivalent to those that are in the methods approved by the legislation. We don't usually address the first one. And we do by comparison to standards that are present, available in the legislation, or they have been developed and agreed by EFSA and maintained over the years. The next one, please. What happens during this period of evaluation? I will explain it later, but from the legal point of view, just to say that EFSA can ask the applicant at any point in time additional information or data or clarification about the dossier, because they thought, well, the working group decided that there was something that was not clear, so we can go back and ask for it. And if what we think, if we think that the amount of information that we request is big enough or is substantial, we can decide to stop the clock during the period that we give the applicant to provide such information. And then when we consider that the information provided, the extra information provided is acceptable, then we restart the clock. And that is also spelled out in the legislation. In point 6, it says if it is duly justified, EFSA can decide to do that. But it's also important to mention that the applicant can approach EFSA at any point in time during the evaluation process during these 6 months to provide additional information or data or clarification from their own initiative. They don't need to they need to wait for EFSA to ask for additional information. They can just submit at any point in time. And at the end of the process, what we do is that the legislation requires that EFSA will forward the opinion to the Commission, the applicant, and the competent authority of the member state concerned. And I will explain how this is all done. So during this period, just a reminder that we can, and usually do, we interact with the applicant for many reasons. And also during this period of 6 months is when we discuss the confidentiality claim by the applicant, and we try to reach an agreement on the confidentiality claim before we reach the end point of the process. The next slide, please. What happens with the output? The output says the legislation that the Commission, within three months of delivery of the assessment, the Commission shall inform to the applicant about the measures to be adopted. And, well, logically, there are two options. Either the Commission will authorize the alternative method or will reject the authorization. And it's important to clarify that even if the applicant claims confidential technical parameters of the method, for example, if the Commission authorizes the alternative method, it will be transposed into the legislation to Annex 4 of the Regulation 142 in the section of alternative methods, and the core parameters and the core description of the method will appear as a new one. And then every single parameter will be published, will put published in the public domain in the legislation, and the method will be applied by any interested party, not only by the applicant, because it will be an approved method by the European Union. Next slide, please. So how it is done in practice? So basically, we were in the point of validating the dossier. We have sent the letter to the applicant, and then internally, EFSA assigns the mandate to a scientific panel. The AVP applications are assigned to the biological hazard panel, one of the 10 scientific panels of EFSA, which will be the responsible for adopting, kind of approving, the final content of the opinion or the evaluation. And how the work is done, basically we set up a working group that will evaluate the dossier, will draft the opinion, and will be and will go back and forth to the panel, the biological hazards panel, informing them of the approaches and the work progress and getting the okay along the process. This is not a very long period because since we start the working after validation until adoption, there are not many months, and we cannot have a lot of meetings. Just to let you know that we have a pool of experts from which we select members for the working group depending on the type of application. They could vary according to the type of animal byproducts, according to the type of method, and then we set up this working group that will draft the opinion. And then when we have the work more or less done, we submit the draft opinion with a conclusion to the biological hazards panel for adoption. And just to mention that during this period, the dossier and the opinion could be subject to public consultation. The non-confidential part could be subject to public consultation, as it was mentioned at the beginning in the first presentation. And at the end, we will take the next steps until the end product is produced. So the next slide, I will just explain very briefly what are the steps. The next slide, please. So what we do is to, as I said, the working group prepares the draft of the scientific output. If it's needed to ask for additional data, as I mentioned, it will be done. We do in parallel the confidentiality assessment, and then when the draft is finalized, we submit it to the scientific panel for adoption. The next slide. So if the panel adopts the opinion, then what we do is that we finalize we prepare the final draft, or we do all the editorial changes and all the check-ins, and then we pre-notify the output to the European Commission and to the applicant under embargo before publication. So we give the chance to the applicant to check and to see that, for example, if there are confidentiality claims accepted and the opinion is sanitized, meaning that section of the opinion, as it was explained before, that are considered confidential, and they will appear black in the opinion if the applicant can check it and agree, and that's why we share the output under embargo approximately 48 hours before publication. Then we go for publication, and then if there is there are no errors or any issue with the publication, it will stay there. If there is a need, then eventually it could be even republished if it is needed. Next slide, please. Just to be very clear, EFSA publishes every single dossier that is evaluated. We put it in the public domain as any other scientific output, as in scientific opinion, and is published in the EFSA journal, all of them. So this is also a good source of information for future applicants to look at previous evaluations. And you can consult them by going to the EFSA website, to the journal, and do searches, and you can find every single EFSA opinion published on the topic. The next slide, please. And again, I just put the link there to the EFSA journal. And also, for example, there is other possibility to consult. If you apply, you submit an application, you can follow up the status of your application in the website, in the Open EFSA. I included the website there, so you can check what is the status of it. And with that, I just finished this presentation, and I give the floor back to Ernesto. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basileos and Angel, for the presentations. We have a question. I realized that you couldn't see it, Angel, from one participant in the webinar. So if you could have a look and see if you can address it now, otherwise we'll take it later. Thank you.
Okay. It is possible to use an alternative method which needs to be authorized for scientific research purpose only in the context of a project which involves different parts from different countries in the EU, meaning that the EVP treated with alternative method is moved inside the EU. Well, I would say that the legislation doesn't specify whether the alternative method is going to be applied at industrial scale or at laboratory scale or any of that. So I would say that in principle, the alternative method should be applied, should be approved. But if it is for experimental purposes, maybe there is some other legislation that covers that, not the ABP. And the issue of doing in different parts of the country, if the method should be approved should be included in the legislation and approved by EFSA, it doesn't matter that it's applied by different countries. As long as the application is coming from one single entity, and then it's processed as such. Then, if the method is approved, it will be it can be applied by anybody from any European Union country. I have to check that, and maybe we will come back to you about this specific issue of the scientific research purpose. But the ABP legislation doesn't mention any specific place where the method has to be applied. So there is no exception for laboratory purposes. However, I will come back to you about this issue. Sorry that we cannot be more clear.
Thank you, Angel. Okay, and we have no further questions to this part. So we then move on to the last part of our webinar on standards and scientific issues that are tackled during the assessment. For that, I invite Dr. Avelino Álvarez Ordóñez, who is a member of the Biological Hazards Panel and the chair of the Standing Working Groups on ABPs. So, Avelino, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. I hope you can hear me. So now it's my turn to talk a bit about the last part of the lifetime of the application. That would be the scientific assessment of the application. As Ernesto was introducing, my name is Avelino Álvarez Ordóñez, and I am a member of the panel on biological hazards. That is the panel that is responsible for conducting the scientific assessment of any new application in this topic, and have been involved in assessment of ABP applications since already around 10 years, and as chair of some of the working groups and some of the assessments that have been delivered in the last years, at least from 3-4 years ago, as chair of the working group, where other scientific experts from different countries are also involved. So I'm going to present in these next few minutes a bit what is the approach. If you move to the next slide, the approach we follow at the working group level and at the panel level to conduct this assessment, how we base our decisions, and how we evaluate the equivalence of the methods that you submit, that any interested applicant submit, in comparison to the methods that are approved in the regulation. And as Angel was mentioning in some previous presentation, I will specifically focus on two main points of the application that we know from experience that are among the most challenging ones, and the ones that sometimes give rise to unsuccessful applications, that are the hazard identification section and the risk reduction section. But I just want to remember that the working group and the panel evaluates all the different sections of the application, not only these two. So it's also important to cover all the aspects that the regulation and the technical assistance, the document on the technical assistance to applicants specifies that all those sections are properly addressed and that all the information is sufficient to carry out all the evaluation. So if we go to the next slide, basically what the working group needs to do is to answer to that question that you see, that is, can the method that has been submitted and then we need to assess be considered at least equivalent to the processing method that is approved in the regulation to that particular objective. So let's say for the production of a particular substance, biodiesel, compost, or whatever, from raw materials from a particular category of ABPs. So let's say for the production of biodiesel from category 1 materials, or for the production of compost from category 3 materials, etc. And for that, so we are following the technical assistance document that was published in 2010 in the EFSA journal, and that was, as Angel was saying, was followed and is translated in the regulation, where it's very clearly stated that the level of risk reduction of any alternative method that is approved must be at least equivalent to that that is achieved by the methods that have been already included in the regulation, and when available, to any processing standards already approved in that regulation, in that ABP regulation 1069 of 2009. So here, the working group and the panel always has faced an issue, a challenge, that is that for many of the methods, the standard methods that are included in the regulation, so all the methods 1 to 7, the standard methods for ABP processing, or any of the alternative methods that have been approved over the years. So we really don't know for sure what is the level of reduction that we achieve with these methods for many of the hazards that may be present in ABP materials. So this is not specified in the regulation, and in some cases there are no experiments at all, or there is no scientific information to know what is the level of reduction that those methods in particular achieve. So the approach we normally have decided to follow, and we have followed over already many years, is okay. What we need to have is some standards, some minimum levels of inactivation that we consider that the methods approved in the regulation achieve, and that we will require the new methods that we assess also to achieve. The fact is that for defining these standards, we somehow are basing also our decisions. We have based as much as possible our decisions also using information included in the regulation. So, but in the regulation only provides standards on levels of reduction for very particular processes or for very particular uses. An example can be seen in the next slide. That is included in Annex 5, Chapter 3, Section 2 of the Regulation 142 of 2011. Here, this Annex 5, Chapter 3, Section 2 specifies some standards that can be used for approval at national level, at member state level, of alternative transformation, alternative processing methods during the production of biogas and composting, and during production of compost. So here, this annex says that the competent authority in any particular member state may authorize the use of parameters others than the one that are specified in the regulation for production of compost and biogas in terms of temperatures, times, particle size, etc., provided that the applicant demonstrates that such new parameters ensure an adequate reduction of biological risks. And it very specifically mentioned that the validation of the new process must demonstrate that the process achieves an overall level of reduction of some hazards. So, for instance, for thermal processes, it mentions a reduction of 5 logs of Enterococcus fecalis or Salmonella september. So it already mentions 2 particular hazards, and a reduction of the infectivity titer of thermoresistant viruses, such as parvovirus, by at least 3 log whenever these thermoresistant viruses are identified as a relevant hazard in the material that is going to be processed. If it's a chemical process, these reductions of 5 logs of Enterococcus or Salmonella and of 5 logs, and of 3 logs of the thermoresistant viruses should be also achieved. But in addition, it also asks for a reduction of resistant parasites such as eggs of Ascari by another 3 logs of the viable stages. So this is an example of one part of the regulation where some standards are available. And the approach that the working group is following, and that has been followed over the years, is to follow a similar approach and to have standards with some minimum levels of reduction that must be achieved in order to consider a method at least equivalent to the one in the regulation. So let's go to the next slide and see a bit what are the standards that we apply in the last that we have applied over the years and in the last decade for all these assessments. So whenever we receive an application that is related to category 1 ABPs, of course here the hazard that is relevant because of its very high resistance to many processing methods is TSEs, TSE agents, prions. So in that case, the standard we have used already in several assessments over the years is a reduction of 6 logs in prion infectivity that must be proved for the alternative method to consider it at least equivalent to the method approved in the regulation. Whenever we receive application for category 3, that we have received also in the last years, a few of them, we are following a standard that is more or less similar to the one that we have seen that in the previous slide for Annex 5 in relation to compost and biogas, with a small changes that I will explain now. So for category 3 ABP, we are using a standard where a reduction of the concentration of any relevant pathogenic bacteria that may be present in the material by at least 5 log reductions for relevant pathogenic bacteria, and a 3 log reduction for the infectious titer of the relevant viruses that may be present, pathogenic viruses, of course, that may be present in the material. For chemical treatments, on top of that, it would be required also a reduction of viable stages of resistant parasites, such as eggs of Ascari, by at least another 3 log. So how the applicant can decide what is the relevant bacteria or the relevant viruses to focus the application on those particular hazards. So this determination of the relevant pathogenic bacteria and viruses should be defined by the hazard identification. That means that it will depend a lot on the raw materials, on the type of subcategory of ABPs, origin. So imagine the species of origin, whether they are coming from ruminants or non-ruminants, from a particular type of subcategory, a particular type of tissue, or a different type of ABP material subcategory within the category 3. No? So that will mean that a very exhaustive and comprehensive hazard identification exercise should be performed to identify which are the most relevant bacteria and viruses that may be present in the material, and then the applicant needs to prove that these 5 logs and 3 logs, 5 logs for pathogenic bacteria and 3 logs for viruses are achieved by this particular process for those hazards that have been selected. If in this hazard identification process the applicant realizes that spore-forming bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, can be present and are relevant, this 5 log level of reduction is also applicable to spores from this bacteria, with one single exception, that is Clostridium botulinum. So whenever Clostridium botulinum is identified as a relevant hazard, a 12 log reduction would be required. That is the typical reduction that is asked for processing canned food for humans, but also in case of ABPs, canned pet food. So it's a very typical log reduction that is asked for thermal processes whenever Clostridium botulinum is identified as a target organism. So as you see, for category 3, the decision tree or the way to decide what is the relevant hazard and what to prove, the level of reduction to prove is a bit more complex than for category 1. That is very straightforward, just prions and just 6 logs. Here is a bit more complex. There is a possibility that is if an applicant sees that the process they are going to apply is, imagine it's applying very, very high temperatures, very high pressures for a very long time. So it seems to be a very stringent process, and the applicant is confident that a good level of inactivation will be achieved for bacterial spores, even if they may not be present in the material. The applicant may decide to directly address spores in their application, so to choose and to use spores of pathogenic bacteria as primary targets without carrying such a complex hazard identification process exercise to identify the most relevant hazards that may be present. Because in principle, any method that is providing this level of reduction of spores, of pathogenic spores in the material should be also capable of reducing any other pathogenic bacteria or viruses that may be present, considering that DSE agents or prions should not be present in category 3 material. Okay. It's important to highlight that these are the standards that we apply to the new method that is proposed, so the alternative method that we are evaluating, independently on whether a pretreatment method is applied. So imagine in some cases, any new method will be preceded by using the method 1 or the method or any of the methods 1 to 7 that are provided in the Commission Regulation 142/2011. There is a mistake in this 142 in the last line of the slide. So imagine that there is these pretreatments with methods 1 to 5 or method 7. So we are not considering any log reduction that these pretreatment methods may provide. So we are assessing only the reductions achieved by the new method, aside of the reductions that may happen due to the pretreatment methods. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. So let's go, once that we know what are the main standards we follow and what are the limits and the log reductions that we are going to look for in our assessments. I want to focus specifically in 2 points of the process, that is the hazard identification and the level of risk reduction. I remember you that there are other parts of the dossier that Angel has highlighted before and that we also assess, as I mentioned before. So, for instance, the first part of the dossier is the full description of the process, the full description of the material to be treated. There, what we do is mainly to check that we have all the information needed to assess the safety of the method, so the level of reduction that may be achieved, etc., and the possible hazards that may be present. Of course, for that, we need a very well description of all the materials that will be used, of all the pretreatments that can be done, of all the flow of the process, etc., etc. So in those sections of the dossier is mainly for us to assess that we have all the information that we need, and if not, to ask again for clarifications to the applicant. So the first key part of the assessment, so after those first 2 sections, is the hazard identification section. So here, what we are going to assess is whether a full hazard identification process detailing all the relevant hazards that may occur in the raw materials has been done. And we are referring to hazards both for animal health and for public health, so also for humans. And this should be an exercise that should be done comprehensively and should be done specific for the matrix. So taking into account, as I was mentioning before, the origin of the ABPs that are used, the subcategory, the category and subcategory of the ABPs that are used, etc., and should be based on scientific evidence. So looking for information in the literature for clarifying what hazards may be present, or even to say why the applicant is not considering other hazards, why the applicant considers that other hazards are not present. Then once this hazard identification is fully done, the applicant should pick among all the hazards that may be present those that are most difficult to be inactivated by the critical parameters. And this should be retained as the primary target for demonstrating the risk reduction achieved by the process. So let's say that we are talking about a thermal process. So among all the hazards identified, the applicant should retain the most thermoresistant hazards that could be present in the material. And whenever it proves that the level of reduction is achieved for the most thermoresistant bacteria, for the most thermoresistant virus, etc., according to the standards that I just explained, so that should be okay. Again, I remind you, as I explained previously, that the applicant may choose to directly use as primary indicators the most resistant organisms probably present in the category of ABPs that is using or that wants to be used in the method. For category 1 ABPs, that is always the case. It's okay for the applicant with just focusing the application of TSE agents without taking care of what other bacteria or viruses or whatever could be present in the material, because any process that is taking care and is controlling TSE agents would, of course, control also any other biological hazards that may be present there. For category 3 ABPs, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the applicant may decide to directly pick bacterial spores due to the very high resistance to different stresses, in particular to heat, but also to others, as a target. And then in that case, if it proves that the sufficient level of reduction already explained in the standards is achieved for the most thermoresistant spores, hazard spores of pathogenic bacteria that could be present in category 3 material is achieved, of course, it doesn't need to take care about other less resistant hazards that could be present. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how can the applicant demonstrate the level of reduction that is achieved for the hazards that have been selected as the most relevant in the hazard identification process? So there are different ways of doing this, of proving the level of risk reduction of the alternative process. In principle, first of all, I want to clarify that what the applicant, even if in the name of the section and in the regulation and in all places is mentioned level of risk reduction, what actually we are asking to do, the applicant to do is to determine and to prove that a sufficient level of hazard reduction is achieved. So we are not estimating risks according to exposure or to probability of illness in the population, etc. We are just seeing if a particular level of reduction of the most relevant bacteria, viruses, spores, or whatever the applicant sees in the hazard identification section that is most relevant is achieved. And the applicant can do that in different ways. And the most appropriate way would be, in principle, to do an experimental validation of the process. So to have the possibility of following the process at experimental level, measuring the reduction of microorganisms that are naturally present in the material, endogenous organisms. Normally, these would be endogenous indicator organisms that are always present in the raw materials, should be always present and in high numbers, because we need to see what is the level of reduction we achieve. So they should be present in high numbers. They should be more resistant to the parameters of the process, let's say to heat or if it's a thermal process, or to pH if it's a chemical process. So they should be more resistant than the biological hazards that may be present there. So they should be good indicators. If they are less resistant than a hazard that could be present, in principle, they wouldn't be appropriate. And they should be easy to quantify and to monitor and to confirm in the lab. So if for those indicators meeting those conditions, it is shown that the level of reduction achieved by the method is good, it meets the standards that we presented, that I presented a few slides ago. So that should be okay. Another possibility is, instead of using an organism that is naturally present in the material, would be to inoculate the material with a well-characterized test organism or a virus introduced in a suitable test body into the starting material. So let's say we inoculate the starting material in a test unit, and we follow we introduce the material in the process in the equipment and apply the process, and then we enumerate that organism before and after the process and see the level of reduction that has been achieved. So that could be an experiment that an applicant could do or could commission to a lab, or to whatever. Here it should be also a surrogate organism or indicator that should also meet the same criteria than before, should be more resistant to the process, if it's a thermal process to heat, or if it's a chemical process to pH, etc., should be more resistant than any hazard that could be present and that is used to monitor or to as an indicator or as a surrogate. No? So it should be a microorganism that if it proves that a 5 log level is achieved to this microorganism, it's very sure that a 5 log level would be achieved for any other bacteria pathogenic hazard that could be present in the material. So again, in both cases, both if it's an indicator organism that is naturally present in the material, or if it's a surrogate organism that has been added and artificially inoculated in the material to see what happens over the process, in both cases, a clear explanation of and a clear proof that is an adequate indicator surrogate organism should be provided in the application. So it's a very key aspect, the election of the indicator or the surrogate organisms. If they are bad selected, it's high chances that the application won't be successful. So a good selection of an indicator or surrogate organism is very important. So this would be the first possibility, to do a laboratory confirmation of the effectivity of the method. So let's go to the next slide. Of course, in these experimental studies, you will have to provide a good description of them. So what very good description on the methodology follow, how many samples were taken, what type of samples, what methods were used for the analysis of the indicator or the surrogate organism, replicates, etc. So for us to address whether the experimental study has been done appropriately and is robust enough to consider to get confidence in the results obtained. Providing also reporting what is the repeatability, doing also some statistical analysis on the results, so to see that what is the variability among replicates, etc., etc. So all that has to be clearly included in the application. It's important in the second bullet point, if this is an important issue, that if the process is a process that involves several steps that in principle will contribute to the inactivation of the hazard, the ideal situation would be to test the inactivation of the indicator or the surrogate organisms along all the process. But if the experiments are done in each of the individual steps of the process individually, an assessment should be performed on the degree to which individual reduction is achieved in each of the steps, but we won't be considering that each step would be additive, if there is no clear proof. So let's imagine that in the first step is proof that a 2 log reduction is achieved, and in the second a 1 log reduction, and in the third step a 2 log reduction. So 2 + 1 + 2 would be 5 log reduction. But if it's not a clear proof that actually there is an additive effect, we won't take that for granted, because it could happen that early steps in the process may compromise the effect of later stages on the process. So the ideal situation would be to test the whole process, not individually each of the steps. And if you test the different steps individually, you have to provide proof that there won't be a compromise in the efficacy on the latest stages of the process. I hope I explained this okay. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, the second possibility would be instead of doing a lab analysis, an experimental study, because sometimes this is not possible. It's not feasible to inoculate some agents or some hazards in the plant, or well, so we also approve methods, or we consider acceptable to provide proof by other means. So let's say by modeling or through comparison with other processes. But in those cases, we need to have also several criteria met. First, the factors leading to the loss reduction should be very well known. So if it's a thermal process or if it's a chemical process, so it should be very well known whether. So imagine what is the effect of the heat on the hazards that we. And there should be a good models or good literature showing what is the effect of that factor. So let's say the temperature, the pH, or whatever, on the hazards that are important in that material. So a model that is well established, a mathematical model, or at least enough literature, enough scientific evidence, previous studies in the literature. And then it should be provided, the applicant should provide evidence of continuous direct measurements of how is the evolution of that factor in the full scale process. So let's say how the temperature is, the temperature profile in the batch reactor. Imagine temperature profile over time to clearly demonstrate that the factors are homogeneously applied in the treated batch. So we need to know that actually those profiles of temperatures, times, etc., are met in the real system. So we allow that to do estimations from models available in the literature or from previous studies done in the literature with the hazards, or actually even with some of these indicator organisms that are more resistant than the hazards that may be present. But here is very important that the data that is used is reflects actually what is done and what would be important in the real process. So let's say if the process is going to be always in a range of temperatures, times, particle size, etc., the data in the literature that you need to provide is with the same temperature range, time, particle size, also in the same matrix, because sometimes, if possible, because we won't be accepting very long extrapolations, saying that you provide evidence for some hazard at a temperature that is a bit different and a different matrix and with different particle sizes, etc. So that decreases the confidence in the supporting evidence you provide. The more different is the information you provide to the real scenario, is decreasing the confidence of the working group during the assessment. So it's very important to try to support your application with experiments that have been done, even if you couldn't do them yourselves or commission to a lab yourselves, to use data in the literature, what is really obtained in conditions that are equivalent to the ones that you want to apply. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just as a final remarks before finishing, I want to highlight that what the working group does is to assess whatever you send in the application. So we assess the method based on the information, the supporting documentation, and any scientific evidence, models, literature, etc., collected from the scientific community that you include in the application. So it's not our task to look for information to support the safety of your method. We just will evaluate whatever you provide to us. Of course, for that, we can use ourselves our literature sources and our expertise, etc. But we are not going to look for information to prove the safety of the method you submit. We are going just to evaluate the information you submit and you provide. Again, I have highlighted mainly what we do for hazard identification, risk reduction assessment, but we address all the sections of the application. We address the hazard plan, we address the risks that may happen due to the disposal of the byproducts or how the wastewater from the process is treated, etc. So you have to take care in the application to all those aspects that are highlighted in the supporting guidance for applicants and in the regulation. And I just wanted to finalize highlighting some of the common mistakes that we have found over the years and that have that gave us a result, a negative outcome in our assessments. That are, for instance, that the hazard identification is not comprehensive or based on solid evidence, so that you missed some of the hazards that could be present and that, according to the literature, can be present in those materials. That maybe you only focus on some particular hazards. For instance, there have been cases where all the process, the hazard identification and the risk reduction has been focusing exclusively on bacterial hazards, while the working group considered that the viruses were also relevant. It has happened also and can happen that you select indicator or surrogate organisms that are not appropriate for testing the efficacy of the method, because there could be other hazards that are more resistant than the indicator or surrogate organisms that you used. As I mentioned before, it's also quite frequent that you provide evidence from literature or from models or from papers published in the literature articles that have been done in different matrices or with different process parameters, not exactly at the same temperature range, with the same times of treatment or particle sizes, etc. So that is also something important for you to consider. Sometimes it also happens that the critical points and the critical parameters in the hazard plan are not properly selected or not totally well described. And also in the interdependent processes, sometimes some byproducts or the procedures to manage with them, because it's not only to describe what byproducts will be generated, etc., but also how you are going to manage them to minimize the risks. So sometimes this is not well described. So these are common mistakes that we have found over the years. So actually, we hope that today's presentations will help you not to make them in the future whenever you decide to submit an application. So I think this was my final slide, if I am right. Yeah, so thank you. And yeah, so I give the floor back to Ernesto.
Thank you, Avelino, for your clear presentation. And thank you to all the speakers for having kept nicely to the time allocated. So we are now reaching the final end of the seminar with the questions and answers session. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we had a number of pre-registered questions that we will try to address now. Several questions were received about the new fertilizers regulation and the links to animal byproducts, with mention of certain component material categories. Also the category 2 animal byproducts as biostimulants, category 2 and 3 animal byproducts treated by pyrolysis, different protein recycling methods in the treatment of meat and bone meal. So all these questions will be now addressed in a global way by my colleague Angel. So Angel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernesto. I will also try to answer this question that is in the chat that was put at 2:13 about the applications alternative method for disposal of category 2 and 3 ABPs by pyrolysis. So basically, all these questions, and in particular this one, are a mixture of different things. One is the endpoint, the other one is the new fertilizer regulation, and the other aspect is the ABP. And there is a bit of everything in there. I'll try to explain a little bit and answer this question. Basically, the first thing to say is that the new fertilizer regulation has been clear in saying that any material under 1069 or any ABP or derived product that has to get the EC new stamp under the new fertilizer regulation must have reached the endpoint in the manufacturer chain. So that is clear. So if there is any material that is not declared endpoint, then it cannot be used under the new fertilizer regulation. So what is the endpoint? And there is another question in the chat saying what explaining the endpoint. I'll see if I am able to explain it. Basically, endpoint is defined in the regulation, in the 1069, in Article 5. And basically says that all the derived products for animal byproducts that are declared endpoint in the manufacturing chains, meaning that they are not longer subject to any requirements of the ABP regulation. Basically, these products can be placed in the market without any restrictions under the regulation. And what that means? Well, that means that they are not subject to official controls as they are according to the 142 regulation. So in theory, these are derived products that are safe enough to be released from the controls that the ABP regulation contemplates. So there are a number of derived products already in the legislation, a limited number of ones. So now the problem is that if you want to use derived products from animal byproducts for fertilizers, they need to get the declaration. And it comes this piece of work that we did, commissioned by the European Commission, because they had this problem. And in the recitals of the fertilizer regulation, explain clearly that the Commission should conduct a risk assessment for those that are not endpoints in order to declare the endpoints and be included in the fertilizer regulation. Now, the issue of the endpoints is let's say, is a risk management decision. It's not in the hands of EFSA. EFSA does not receive mandates to say, can we declare this endpoint? We do conduct a risk assessment for methods or processes or safety of products, but the decision of declaring an endpoint is in the hands of the European Commission. So in the work that we did for the organic fertilizer soil improvers opinion, we receive a list of materials from the Commission that we should to assess level of safety with the view of declaring them endpoints, but there are not the standards to declare endpoints in terms of safety. So for this particular work, we developed certain standards, we agreed with the Commission, which were what Avelino explained a few minutes ago, the alternative methods for biogas and composting. And we used those standards to apply to the list of materials that we received. As a result of that, the Commission is proposing to amend the legislation and to introduce a new list of endpoints. And that is where it comes the issue of the category 2 and 3 animal byproducts by pyrolysis. And, just to mention that the proposal of the amendment of the regulation has been put to public consultation, it's been in the public domain. And one of the items that are proposed as endpoint is ash obtained from category 2 and 3 materials according to Annex 2 or 3 of the 142 regulation. And this is coming from the EFSA assessment, because the EFSA was asked to assess ashes from category 2 and 3 materials from incinerator, co-incineration or combustion, but not to assess ashes from category 2 or 3 materials from pyrolysis. So the material that is proposed to be endpoint now
is ashes from category 2 and 3 materials from incineration, co-incineration, and combustion. So I don't think that that includes pyrolysis, if I am not mistaken. So the question is not for us in a way, because we were only asked to assess ashes coming from category 2 or 3 material from particular methods, incineration, which is the usual disposal for many animal byproducts. So pyrolysis is not included in that method. So that would be something to clarify and to ask the Commission if in the proposal they would include pyrolysis or not. Second, pyrolysis is not included in the ABP regulation as an alternative method, if I'm not mistaken, for use of disposal of ABPs. So if, for example, any party is interested in using ashes from these ABPs to be used as fertilizers, then they would need to get the endpoint status. And that's the same with, for example, there was another question about mentioned about meat and bone meal. Meat and bone meal in the new proposed amendment is included as endpoint. I think. Let me check. I think that yes, category meat and bone meal are included in the proposed list of new endpoints, which is also important because there was a question about that. I hope that I've answered the question. 3 items. Endpoints is the prerogative of the Commission. Any ABP or derived product that has to go as organic fertilizer needs to get the endpoint. And then if there is a method that is not included in the ABP regulation and it wants a party is interested in applying it for the fertilizer or for any other use, then yeah, they will have to submit it to EFSA for evaluation. I hope that I answered these questions.
Thank you, Angel, for the comprehensive answer. So moving on to another group of questions or comments that we observed in our pre-registered system. There were mere mention to different methods for the processing of ABPs or for the processing of other non-ABP materials. We've mentioned to, for example, derived products such as struvias. So I will give the floor now to Avelino to just clarify a bit this point for the participants. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, again, we understand the question refers to whether these methods or these products can be used and how or to process or to use ABPs. No, so for that it's very important, and as Angel was mentioning before, to check both ABP regulations 1069/2009 and 142/2011. To check whether that is the case, whether any of these processes products is included in those regulations. In most of the cases of what you highlighted in your question, it was about alkaline hydrolysis, carbonization, pyrolysis, gasification, composting, struvias, biochar, etc. So many of these, for instance, carbonization, biochar, struvias, are not really mentioned in the regulation. So there is no mention to them at all in the ABP's regulation. What you can find in those annexes, of course, I remind you, so annexes of Regulation 142/2011 contain very useful information to clarify some of these aspects. So for instance, in Annex 4, you find all the aspects related to the processing, you know, from the standard methods to the approved alternative methods. Then you have annexes related to very particular products like Annex 5 for biogas and compost, etc., etc. So it's there where you need to check whenever you have a doubt, and if you find the process you are interested in, or the product you are interested in, and you want to apply. if you have doubts whether this is covered in the ABP regulation, the best is to contact the European Commission and to clarify that. And of course, if you think it's an alternative process to one of those described in the regulation, you should be able to submit an application following all the procedures that we have described today over the webinar. Again, it's very important if only includes animal byproducts, because some of these products like the biochar, etc., in most cases can be obtained from other materials that are not ABPs, and if it's not ABPs, of course, any of what we are discussing today applies. So I hope this is okay. They were a very wide array of processes and products that, as I was mentioning, in most cases were not included clearly in the regulation, and it's for you to clarify with the Commission. And that's it.
Okay,
so I give the floor back to Ernesto.
Thank you, Adelina, for the reply to those comments and questions. Then we also have a question about the recycling of phosphorus and about concretely using of ash as a starting point in the feed chain. My colleague Angel is going to give an answer to that. So please, Angel, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I just want to clarify something about the answer to the previous questions about the category 2 and 3 ashes from pyrolysis. And there was a comment on the chat, I think, that the pyrolysis is not used to process animal byproducts. Well, I was answering the question because the question was specifically about category 2 and 3 animal byproducts by pyrolysis. It's true that in the CMC 14, when this talks about the struvite, the biochar and ashes, mostly there we are talking about bio-waste and material of vegetal origin, not animal byproducts. But the question was specific about category 2 and 3 animal byproducts. So just to clarify this point. And then the question about the recycled phosphate was the comment to get EFSA to approve ash as a safe starting point and open up EU possibility to get sustainable, recycled, safe, and clean feed phosphates. And it was mentioning to recover phosphorus from sewage sludge ash. Well, to be honest, and the question also mentioned the fertilizer opinion of EFSA, etc. But it has to say that sewage sludge is not animal byproduct, so this is completely out of the scope of this issue. The problem of recycling phosphorus from ashes from the organic fertilizer point of view, as I mentioned before, it can only be the endpoint as such is declared for category 2 and 3 ABP through incineration or co-incineration. So if the question is specifically about ashes from sewage sludge, it has nothing to do with the ABP regulation. That's what I have to answer to this question.
Thank you, Angel. Yes, thank you, Angel, for the answer. And there is another question or doubt about the use of manure as feed for insects, and that's going to be addressed by Avelina. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. Yeah, so the question refers to the fact of whether pig manure can be used to feed insects that are not used actually the insects in the food or the feed chain, but for technical purposes. Again, this is a legal issue that probably is best to check with the European Commission for advice and for consultation. But as even is mentioned also in the question, the same question mentions that Insects are considered farm animals, and farm animals cannot be fed with manure because manure is category 2 material, and only some category 3 materials can be used for feeding them, like fish meal, blood, from non-ruminants, de-entry calcium, phosphate of animal origin, some hydrolyzed proteins, hides and skins, gelatin, collagen from non-ruminants, eggs and egg products, milk and some milk-derived products, etc., etc. So, in principle, interpret that they cannot be used for farming insects, but again, it's best for all these legal issues. The best point is the Commission for consultation. So, thank you, Ernesto. I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Avelino. Yes, we have another question on whether there are any specific categories of animal byproducts that cannot be used. And that one is going to be addressed by Angel. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernesto. Specific categories of animal byproducts that are not able to use. Well, the first thing you should say is that in practice, all animal byproducts can be used. The question is what uses are authorized or not. And it all depends on the category of the animal byproducts. We know that we have 3 categories. From the highest risk, category 1 material based on the TSE risk, to category 2, and then category 3, which is the least, the lowest risk, which has more uses. They have more authorized uses, like for example for feed. So in theory, in practice, all animal byproducts can be used, and the one that has least amount of uses or authorized uses is definitely category 1 material, for the reason I just mentioned. Categories 1 material, usually they are disposed by incineration and then and the like, but they can be used also for example, for biogas. They can use for fuel, for combustion, incineration, and little else, because the category 1, but the rest they can be used for other purposes. So there is not a single animal byproduct that cannot be used for certain things. That was what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel, for clarifying that point. We have another question on on-farm carcass disposal by alternative methods and whether that is acceptable or not. That's going to be taken by Avelino. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. So yeah, in principle, dead on-farm animals are category 2 ABP materials, and according to the ABP regulation, they can be disposed in 2 ways: by incineration without prior processing, or after processing by pressure sterilization. That would be method 1 of the standard processing methods. Or the second alternative is by composting after pressure sterilization. Any other alternative method, which could be including the on-farm methods of disposal, may be authorized following an assessment. So that means that anyone interested on that could submit an application, and actually I think there were some assessments a few years ago on these topics on the disposal on farm of the chicken, the pigs, etc. So that could be a possibility. So an application could be submitted for approving an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Avelino. And I think we are now approaching the end of the time allocated. We had a number of questions on procedural aspects that we hope were clarified with the presentations given. before. If not, we are of course available to clarify any doubts you may have through the channels that were presented before. And finally, there were a number of questions more on regulatory aspects that, as I mentioned at the beginning, would be out of scope for the webinar today, and for which our colleagues in the European Commission would be best placed to address those questions. So with that, to thank you all again for the interest in this event. I hope you found it informative, and as I mentioned, a recording of the event and the presentations given will be made available also to the participants and the general public in general in our webpage. So thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody.